Well, welcome to Principle 1 of Worship Leader Training in this series. Our first principle to understand about leading worship well is that we are called to point people to Jesus. In order to effectively lead worship, we need to understand our most fundamental role, which is to point people to Jesus, to draw their eyes, to draw their attention heavenward toward God and toward His glory and His grace. You see, one of the biggest problems with many worship teams is they end up actually drawing more attention to themselves than to God. Now, usually this isn't purposeful, this is inadvertent, but we just live in a culture that's used to seeing performers on stage. And so it's easy to just create this atmosphere where the attention is just sort of naturally on the band when they're playing those songs. But if we're going to overcome this, we have to be very intentional and purposeful about pointing people to Jesus. Now, in order to do this, we first have to understand and communicate to our people that worship, what it is it is a response to God. Fundamentally, worship is a response that people should have when they encounter the truth about God. You see, Jesus actually taught this when He encountered a Samaritan woman in the book of John chapter 4, and she was asking Him about the proper way to worship. And His response was this. He said this, that genuine worshipers will worship God in spirit and in truth. You see, what He was saying was when people encounter the truth about God, it should evoke a response from deep within us, from within our spirit that wants to respond to that truth in worship. You know, that term worship, it comes from the Old English word worth-ship, where we are ascribing worth to someone or something. And when we understand the truth about God, we respond to it by recognizing that He alone is fully worthy of our worship. And so our goal is to draw people's attention to that truth about God and to His glory and to His grace. And as we do, our desire should be to see people respond with all of who they are. Again, it talks about spirit and in truth, and that spirit part of who we are, that is the deepest core of our being. So we should engage people at the deepest part of who they are, all of their being, in responding to God's truth, with their mind, with their emotion, with their will, with everything. There's a great definition of worship that a church leader in England named William Temple gave. He said this. He said, worship is the submission of all of our nature to God. It is the quickening of our conscience by His holiness, the nourishment of our mind by His truth, the purifying of our imagination by His beauty, the opening of our heart to His love, and the surrender of our will to His purpose. And all of this is gathered up in adoration, the most selfless emotion of which our nature is capable. You see, the first point in understanding this principle that worship is about pointing people to Jesus is understanding that worship is a response to God. All of who we are responding to that truth about God. But here's a second idea. If we're going to engage people in that whole life response to God, we have to make sure that we're worshiping ourselves. That you as a worship leader are actually worshiping yourself. You see, if you as a worship leader aren't fully engaged in worshiping God, you're going to have a very hard time leading people to do that. You see, in our world today, we live in a place where people are very sensitive to when people are faking it. If you're not being authentic, people will pick up on that, and it's going to be very hard to lead them in worship. And so we need to make sure that we exemplify a genuine pursuit of God, that we're really worshiping, responding to His truth ourselves as we worship. In the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, it says this, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. You see, as a worship leader, it's especially important that you are actively casting aside all the distractions, all those things that hold us back, and that you are fixing your eyes on Jesus as you lead others in worship. Now, first, this should happen on stage when you're up there during a service. So don't be focused on what people are thinking about you. Don't be focused on the crowd that's out there in front of you. Don't even just be focused on making sure you play the music properly. Now, yes, you want to make sure that you play the music to the best of your ability because you don't want to be a distraction. But music even shouldn't be your primary focus. God should be your primary focus. You should always be saying, I want to fix my eyes on Jesus as I'm up here leading worship. And secondly, you should be a genuine worshiper even when you're off stage. You know, as a worship leader, you hold a great deal of influence at your church. You're one of the most visible leaders at your church. And so you should make sure that you have integrity in your life as a follower of Jesus Christ. Not that you're going to be perfect, but that you are a genuine pursuer and worshiper of God, even when you're not in church on Sunday. You should try to demonstrate that worship is more than just singing. By the way you live your life, you should be actively seeking to exemplify a whole life response to God in worship. And so worship is a response to God that should elicit in us this desire to respond to all of who we are, giving Him the glory. And if you're going to do that, you need to be a worshiper yourself. The final important point is to understand, if you want to point people to Jesus, you need to understand that it's not about you. You see, this should be obvious, but the human heart has this strong natural inclination toward pride. It's one of the strongest parts of our sinful nature. It's in all of us. And if we're not careful and intentional, leading worship can very easily become about our own glory, our own reputation, rather than about God. You see, there's a great example of this in the New Testament. A great leader, John the Baptist, he understood this. And so he said this in the book of John, chapter 3 and verse 30. He said, speaking about Jesus, he must become greater and greater, and I must become less and less. You see, he said that because John was kind of a rock star in his day, and people were wanting to give him all kinds of attention. He said, no, it's not about me. He said, make sure that Jesus is the one that you are seeing. And so he went out of his way to make sure that Jesus was exalted, that he was seen as greater and greater, and so he had to become less and less. And that's the same attitude that we need to have as we lead worship in our church. And so in leading worship, you need to actively guard your heart against pride. If you're not careful, it will easily creep in, especially when you have a musical gift, one of those outward talents that people see. It's easy to get caught up and seek, people's accolades and the applause. And it can easily feed our pride, and it makes it about us. And also make sure that not only are you trying to guard your heart against pride, that make sure that practically you're not doing anything as you lead that's going to draw attention to yourself. Whether it be your words or the expressions you make with your body language or your outward attitude or whatever it is, make sure that there's nothing you're doing that's going to cause someone in the church to take their eyes off of Jesus and to put it on you. Because every time you draw attention to yourself, you're drawing attention away from Jesus. And so the first and most foundational important point to understand is this, that we are called to point people to Jesus as we lead in worship.